Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I'm going to be talking to you about The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This is a book that I just recently read in the month of February, and it was my viewer pick for the month. So not every month, but hopefully quite a few times this year, I am giving the viewers on my channel a chance to pick a book off my bookshelf for me to read and do a standalone review of. And in the month of February, it was The Bluest Eye. So let's go ahead and talk about it. I'm going to start by telling you what this book is about. And I've actually decided, for a variety of reasons, that I'm actually just going to read the back of the book to you as an explanation and quick synopsis. So it says Pecola breathed love, a young black girl praised every day for beauty. Mocked by other children for the dark skin, curly hair, and brown eyes that set her apart, she yearns for the blonde hair and blue eyes that she believes will allow her to finally fit in. Yet as her dream grows more fervent, her life slowly starts to disintegrate in the face of adversity and strife. A brilliant examination of our obsession with beauty and conformity, Toni Morrison's virtuosic first novel asks powerful questions about race, class, and gender with the subtlety and grace that have always characterized her writing. So, the reason I wanted to share the back of this book with you instead of giving a summary myself is because, one, I feel like it's a pretty concise synopsis of the book, but also because I think it does and does not tell you what this book is about. And I hope that will become apparent as I go through discussing this book. Per usual, however, I am going to start with a short review of this book, and then I will go into a longer version of the review where I will talk about all the different elements in the book that stood out to me. For now, though, I am just going to share with you what I felt like were my highs and lows in the books, what I rated it, and who I would recommend this book to. So I had two highs for this book. One of them was the use of symbolism, particularly the very subtle use of flowers as a way of talking about beauty as a construct. I also liked the theme that this book discussed in general, as well as the central idea of beauty and ugliness, and just the entire exploration of the two major themes that I saw in this book, which were the idea of self loathing and the concept of beauty in society. The low for me in this book, however, had to do with two points of view that came in very late in the story. They were from two different characters in the book. One character had been in the book the entire story, and the other character was actually introduced just for basically one chapter in the book. And these two points of views were just despicable points of views that to go into these characters' heads to me felt out of place and came very late in the book and unexpectedly. And I think just overdid what Toni Morrison was trying to accomplish, both in those scenes as well as in her book as a whole. If you've read the book, then you know what I'm talking about, and I will go into in more depth in the long portion of this exactly what kind of went on. In both cases, it'll be without spoilers, but if you just want a short review of this book, just know that there are two points of view that you definitely may want to check some content warnings on. I found going into these characters' heads made those scenes too intimate with the wrong people, and it was more traumatizing as a reader and for the individual that you're watching this happen to than I think it needed to be. I think they were both scenes that could have still potentially been in the book, but more would have been accomplished by telling us what happened to our protagonist than showing it. It was really harsh and horrible and went on for too long. I really think it took away from the messaging and wasn't necessary in the way that it was done in this book. That said, there is so much to recommend about this book that I did surprisingly still give it 4 stars. So hopefully that was quick enough and to the point enough that it gives you some idea of whether or not you want to read this book, but I'm now going to go into the entire book as a whole in much more depth. So let's start out by talking about Toni Morrison herself. Toni Morrison is, I feel like at this point, a very well-known African American author. She has written numerous books, and this was actually her debut novel, which I am extremely impressed by. She was born in 1931 and passed away in 2019, and she was born in Lorain, Ohio, which is pretty significant as that is actually the setting of this novel. In fact, this novel came out of one of her own childhood experiences that awoke her to the idea that beauty is something that one does, either to oneself or to others. And the same, I think, would be said for ugliness. In fact, I think she argues and learned from that childhood experience that beauty is sort of a construct that those around us and we ourselves allow to be made. And so, out of that childhood experience and memory, she ended up deciding to write this book. What was her purpose or the message that she was trying to get across? Well, fortunately, I have one of, I think, the anniversary editions of the book, and sorry for any glare. And in the introduction, it actually shares from her what her intent was in writing this book. The project then for this, my first book, was to enter the life of one of the least likely to withstand such damaging forces because of youth, gender, and race. I focused, therefore, on how something as grotesque as the demonization of an entire race could take root inside the most delicate member of society, a child, the most vulnerable member, a female. Yeah, not a happy, upbeat, cheerful topic. So don't expect this book to be because it's not. Okay, I turned on the light because it's going to start getting dark pretty quickly here. But let's go ahead and talk about the plot of this novel, including the sequencing of events. So, this story is told in a nonlinear fashion. At the very beginning of the book, we are sometime into the future or in the present of the narrator compared to when the rest of the book takes place. And so, the vast majority of the book is told as sort of a flashback or a recounting of previous events. There is a little bit of fuzziness in terms of the timeline of where we are at the beginning and the end of the book. So that's why I'm kind of hedging on that. I wasn't totally clear as to whether the beginning and the end of the book are in the present for our narrator or if at some point our narrator is like further into the future. So I hope that's not confusing, but at the very least, you should know that this book is told by a narrator who is looking back at fairly recent events. Let's put it that way. Yeah. Okay. For me, the plotting and sequencing of the events that happen in this story are there because, as Toni Morrison states in the introduction, as well as in the opening of the book, the focus on the book is not why do these things happen to this young girl, but rather how did things get to where they are. And so you kind of need to go back in time, if you will, to understand the present and the future. I also think the sequencing of the books contribute to the plot really well in terms of they help build up the tension and the understanding of how things came about. I found myself already invested in where this story was going to go, and I was sort of left with the question of, okay, how did things get to this place? Because the book opens with a lot of shocking information, and I definitely wanted to find out, like, what did you just tell me and how did we just get there? We will experience a variety of different complications that happen in her life as she goes around. These complications are brought upon her by friends, family, and the vast majority of the community that she lives in. And the various events also serve as foils for what her life is like. There are a lot of things in her life that are just unique to her and or her family. So before we talk about Pecola, I think it's important to talk about the narrative voice and the point of view in which the story is told from, because if you are like me, you tend to read the backs of books. And if you notice on the back of the book, when I read it to you, the only person that is named or mentioned on the back of the book is Pecola Breedlove. While Percola is the central character in the book, she is not the narrator. We actually have a first person narrator in this book, and that actually surprised me because all I heard about the book was that we were going to be following this young girl, Pecola, and through her life, and that is not necessarily the case. Our first person narrator is Claudia, and she is actually a character that is involved in the action in this story. In fact, her role in the story is she eventually becomes friends with Pecola as they both live in the same town. And at one point, Pecola even moves into her home with her. So we hear this entire story of Pecola from Claudia's perspective growing up, or at least spending this year and change with her. She's also known her before this time period, so we get Pecola's background also through Claudia's perspective. There are some really interesting things about having Claudia as a narrator. One, she is, like I mentioned, Pecola's friend eventually, Actually, they are classmates, schoolmates, so they are similar age characters. I think this was a very intentional use of an outside character by Toni Morrison in telling this story. I think it does separate us a little bit from all the harm that is being done to Pecola. So I do appreciate that as a author, she does protect us a bit from Pecola's experiences because they are pretty harsh. The other part that I think is interesting about having Claudia is it does keep you as a member of the children in the book. So even though you're not experiencing a lot of the harsh environment as Pecola is, you are still having this childlike struggle to understand what's going on and why. And I think that leaves a lot more room for the reader to reflect on what's happening because we as readers and as adults can read between the lines in a way that Claudia cannot. And I think that's helpful because it does make you slow down and think about the various things that she's seeing. Claudia really is just serving as our observer of events, who is slightly removed from the events. The thing I liked least in this book, I mentioned earlier, had to do with 2 points of view that do come up. Let me talk some more about those specific points of view that honestly just gave me the ick. I'll start first by talking about the father's perspective. I really could not see a reason why, in this particular scene, which is basically the climax of the story, that we had to switch into the father's perspective. I wouldn't have wanted to be in Pecola's perspective either, if that tells you anything about the situation. But I don't feel like it was necessary to be in the father's perspective in his head. I would have much rather, again, continued to have that distance of just a sudden third person omniscient narrator or a dream sequence or something. But it was too much. And I don't feel like, as a reader, I understood the motivation for making that choice. The other perspective that we get is from another character. Again, I don't want to give you too much details of who that character is, but you'll figure it out if you read the book and get to it. I do feel like there is a reason we are introduced to this character and that their scene is there. And I felt like that episode in the book was more important to have not necessarily details on certain events, but it was important to have that episode in that moment with that character. And the reason being is that I felt like that was a point of view that Toni Morrison included because it's after some of the major horrible things have happened to Pecola and is at the height of her self-loathing that she has a conversation with this character. I think their conversation is important, and I think his thoughts after he meets with her are important. What I did not think was necessary is like hearing about his whole backstory and his issues. I really wish the focus had just remained on sort of his like trickery and like fooling of the townspeople as well as his thoughts and prayers because he does get to view and discuss in the form of a prayer his thoughts on Pecola's situation. And I thought that was important because it's one of the few times we have an adult process what has happened to her in the book. And in processing that, Toni Morrison does use it as an opportunity to talk about themes that a child would not naturally reflect on. And that includes largely just the problem of suffering and how to understand that, especially in a faith based community. So I appreciated having that conversation and more specifically that prayer in the book from an adult, but I did not like the adult she gave the prayer to. It really took away from the theme. I actually think it shifted your feelings on the book and what happened to Pecola, and it took you away from focusing on how did Pecola get to this point. Like you know how she got to that point. But I think it also unintentionally made it so that even though the entire plot had built up to all these different things contributing to her self-loathing, at the end of the book you ended up feeling like it was just one thing that contributed to her self-loathing and it kind of like overshadowed all the other events in the book. And I don't think that was Toni Morrison's intention. And the reason I don't think that is because I'm thinking about what she said in the introduction to this book. Forward to the book, she says, one problem was centering the weight of the novel's inquiry on so delicate and vulnerable a character could smash her and lead readers into the comfort of pitying her rather than into an interrogation of themselves. And I think that's exactly what happens with these two episodes that occur at the end of the book. I think up to that point, yes, you feel bad for Piccola, but I found myself reflecting on the variety of different issues that were being brought up, especially surrounding beauty, just thinking about, like, how have I had different situations in my life that are like that? I made a lot of text to life connections, but then these two episodes occur, and the next thing you know, you're just so disgusted and so horrified, assuming you don't just put the book down there and not even finish it. Your focus just becomes on feeling so bad for Piccola, for this young girl, and what happened to her, that it's hard to focus on yourself anymore. And if that was Toni Morrison's intention, was for us to self-reflect, that's not happening from that point on in the book. And so that is why, for me, it was like the biggest low. Not only did it make me want to put the book down, but it also really drove me away from her intention. And I did go from self-reflecting to, I don't know if pity is the right word, but just feeling horrible for this young girl and focusing on that emotional feeling more. You also have the townspeople, I would say, the major other group of characters in here, whether they are other children in the town or whether they are other adults. And they often serve as some of the sources of antagonism for Piccola, and to, sort of instigate her downfall. But they also serve as foils and points of comparison for her, as well as just other sources to give you a different angle and perspective of what self-loathing and or beauty, or conceptions of beauty can look like. I don't feel like the town itself was extremely significant in the plot and theme of the book. However, I do think it was important that it took place in a small town because it did allow for a lot of the gossip that happened to go around in the town. It did allow for some of the circumstances that ended up happening to Piccola to take place, as well as it allowed for this sense of very close community attack. I don't know that in a larger space you could have felt like Piccola was being attacked from so many sides if it wasn't such a small space. The other aspect of the setting that came into play throughout this book is that you do go into different homes in the book. And because of that, again, you get different perspectives on the concept and idea of beauty. You get different perspectives on how people perceive Piccola and how they perceive themselves. So I thought it was really unique to have that element of different households. As I move into talking about the theme of the book, I'm going to start by talking about some of the central ideas that come up in the book. And the back of the book actually mentioned quite a few of them. But overall, I would say that the themes that I caught are a discussion of beauty standards or beauty conformity, race, class, gender, and racial self loathing, or just self loathing in general and its origins. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the intent of this book, and I feel like I caught it, was the focus on how does racial self-loathing happen. And um, Toni Morrison in the foreword talks about how beauty is something that is done to you or to someone. And I think you see that in both directions. You see how beauty is done to people or how people do it to themselves, right? And like how they form that concept of beauty for themselves. But you also see it for the inverse of it in terms of ugliness. You see how ugliness is something that you do to someone or someone does to themselves. It's very deep and I very much enjoyed it. And then finally, let's talk about the writing, because I had a lot of like misconceptions about how this book was going to be written. I have only read one other book by Toni Morrison. It was either Sula or Beloved. And maybe that book is written differently, or maybe I just wasn't in the right headspace. I was in high school, so maybe that had something to do with it too. But I just remember her writing style being very difficult to read and convoluted. That was not my experience with this book. So I don't know. You tell me if that is true for her other books or not. But I found that her writing had a lot of distinct features. Her narrator had a very distinct voice. I think she did a good job of balancing that idea of the narrator both being young at the time these events were happening and shortly thereafter, but also in some way reflecting back at it on it as slightly older, because the voice was not the voice of a child. Like, this is not narrated by a child. I don't feel like there were a ton of children's voices in the book, and I think that's a good thing because the issues are so harsh and heavy. I also want to talk about the chapter titles and the opening of the book. The book opens in a sort of familiar children's story fashion, like the see Dick and Jane, see Spot Run, those kinds of simple sentence children's stories. There's a whole series of that at the beginning, and the chapter titles of the book, if you will, are taken from that opening story, and it's all smashed together. And initially, I thought it was just nonsense letters. Then I thought the chapter titles were just nonsense words taken from that story, but really pay attention to those chapter titles. There's a certain part of the book that you would prefer to skip. Those chapter titles will help you do that because once you start to see how the chapter titles are connected to what is in the chapter, you will get to a point where you'll read a chapter title and you'll go, I don't want to hear about that. Overall, I was very surprised by this book. I had a very strong emotional reaction to what happened to Piccola, partially because I was so invested in her as a character, but I also experienced a lot of disgust and angst over those two points of view. So, very mixed for me in terms of my reaction. I really, really did not like those two points of view, and I would say that's the main reason I gave this book a 4 instead of a 5. If those had have just been handled more delicately for what they were, I think this would have been a book that was a 5 for me. I don't like being traumatized by my books. I don't think that's an experience that I like. But I was warned. She said in the foreword, like a journey to destruction, and it is. And you go with it and you experience that. And if, like me, you don't like that, don't ignore that warning. That's all I can say. I did really appreciate what she discussed in this book. I think she just missed the mark on that one part of her message just by the way those two scenes were written. But for this to be a debut novel, I think that's more than understandable, and it's way better than anything I could do. So, those are all my thoughts on The Bluest Eye and my reading experience and my thoughts on each of the sections of it. I hope that gives you a lot more information to understand what to expect out of the different parts of this book, and as well as giving you an idea of what I liked and didn't like about it and how effective I think those parts were as a whole, and why I ended up giving the book 4 stars. So, hopefully, if you want to, you will go and pick this book up and maybe have a better understanding of what it's about. Again, it is basically the story of Piccola Breedlove as told by her schoolmate Claudia, exploring how Piccola's life fell apart. So that's it for me. Like and subscribe if you liked this video and you would like to see more videos like this. And let me know if you've read this book and what you thought about it. And I will talk to you next time. Bye.